Welcome to WitchLit, a place to talk about the craft of writing and writing the craft. I'm your host, Victoria Rashke, author, publisher, witch, and nosy Scorpio. WitchLit is brought to you by Thousand Bolt Press, a family-owned independent publisher established to produce the books we want to see in the world. Titles including Changing Past by Yvonne Abarrow, Conjuring the Commonplace by Lane Fuller and Corey Thomas Hutchison, and my latest book, Verona Green, can be purchased directly from thousandvoltpress.com or wherever you buy books. Rachel Pollack authored 41 books, including 2 award-winning novels, Unquenchable Fire, winner of the Arthur C. Clarke Award, and Godmother Night, winner of the World Fantasy Award. She also wrote a series of books about tarot, 78 Degrees of Wisdom being the best known, a book of poetry, Fortune's Lover, and had translated with scholar David Vine, Sophocles' Oedipus Tyrannus, Oedipus Rex, under the title Tyrant Oedipus. She designed and illustrated her own tarot deck, the Shining Tribe Tarot. With artist Robert Place, she created 2 more decks, the Burning Serpent Oracle and the Raziel Tarot. For 11 years, she taught at Goddard College's MFA writing program. Rachel lived with her wife and manager, Zoe Madoff, in New York's Hudson Valley. Pollack died from non-Hodgkin lymphoma on April 7th, 2023, at the age of 77. We are going to talk about that award-winning book, Godmother Night. And from the Kirkus Review, kind of a brief overview for folks who haven't read it. While this book begins as a depiction of modern lesbian life, it grows inexorably into a magical exploration of the deepest roots of life and death. Pollack tells a story that shifts with remarkable ease between the world of mundanity and the world of fairy tale and folklore. Essentially, it falls into 3 large movements, which do not quite match the novel's internal divisions. In the first, we meet Lori and Jake, 2 college women who fall in love, and after Lori drops out of graduate school, set up housekeeping. They have several disturbing encounters with a mysterious woman called Mother Night and her entourage of motorcycle girls. Jake eventually decides that she wants to become a mother. A friend finds an anonymous sperm donor, and in due course, Jake gives birth to a daughter, Kate. Shortly thereafter, Jake dies, and we learn that Mother Night is death incarnate. In the second section, we see Kate growing up. Lori has adopted her, with Mother Night in the role of godmother. Kate is a bit of a misfit in school, but she moves easily in the ghostly world revealed to her by her godmother. Mother Night offers Kate, who is deeply affected by the suffering of others, a healing potion which she can save some of those whom conventional medicine cannot help, but only those whom Mother Night tells her are not already doomed. In the third section, we see Kate grown up and working as a healer. When she begins to question Mother Night's decisions, she has to face a difficult choice with the fate of her own lover in the balance. Throughout the narrative, Pollack finds graceful transitions between realistic portrayals of modern urban life and a fantastic landscape peopled with angry ghosts, lesbian biker Valkyries, and incarnations of supernatural powers. Tender and disturbing, down-to-earth, and wildly inventive, this complex novel shows Pollack to be one of our best fantasists. And to talk about this novel, Charles Harrington is joining me again. And since he's been on the show already, I'm going to let him introduce himself, and then we will jump into talking about Godmother Night. Charles.
Oh, I'm so very thankful to be here. My name is Charles Harrington, and I like tarot. I am a huge fan of Rachel Pollack. Specifically about me, I did author the Tarot of the Vampires, which was illustrated by Craig Marr. And I also recently, a new one that came out for me was the Oracle of the Inferno, based on Dante's Inferno, which is a great way if you want to start your day with a card with people on fire or being bitten by snakes. So
a great card of the day deck.
Absolutely. So
Awesome.
I'm very excited about this book. Real quick question: did you ever get to meet Rachel Pollack at any of the? She used to go to a lot of pagan and events.
Yeah, I did not get to meet Rachel, which seems like a great loss because she seems like a remarkable person all around. Did you get to meet her?
I did a couple of times, and maybe some of those moments will come up in our conversations too. But she was a
Awesome.
Wild, wonderful lady.
Yeah, I just the outpouring when Neil Gaiman, everyone's can bingo now. posted about her going into hospice, like just that outpouring of people whose lives she had touched was kind of remarkable to watch.
It was sometimes, you have those odd celebrity death moments, and sometimes this was a rare moment where we were sort of alerted. I knew she'd been suffering for a long time, and like the tarot community was really great about sort of being there for her and stepping up, and I'm sure other communities that she's a part of as well, because she touched so many different people. But it was hard to lose her. It was hard to read this book sometimes knowing that she was not with us anymore, but that also I've had some kind of wacky moments since then of kind of feeling like she's with us still and having like saint-like moments. So anyway.
Yeah. So being that you are a tarot card deck creator and a tarot reader, and the brief for these episodes is always, like a classic work of WitchLit that, one of the precepts for people who listen, the author has to be dead. It has to be someone I couldn't get to come on the show, basically. So you chose one of Rachel's fiction novels rather than 78 Degrees of Wisdom or one of her other tarot books. So why did you want to read the fiction? Why did you want to talk about that?
It's a great question. I think that tarot people, 78 Degrees of Wisdom is sort of a sacred text in the world of tarot. It's sort of up there with, I'd say, Tarot for Yourself by Mary Greer, alive, great, wonderful. Reach out to her. And a few other sort of iconic tarot texts. So 78 Degrees of Wisdom, I think people read, and they tend to read it reverently. And then there's another book I'd love to talk about later that I think is her tarot magnum opus. But I think it really helps to read some of her other types of books out there. I really love her fiction. She has a wonderful series about Jack Shade, which is he's a sort of a shaman detective. And it's a cool sort of urban fantasy book. But I'd never read Mother Night before. And I'd heard about it. I knew it was an award winner. I knew it kind of put her on the map in the in the science fiction and fantasy community in many ways. So I wanted to check that out. And I think that understanding her fiction or reading her fiction helps clue us into how she weaves mythical elements into her tarot work, into her everything.
Yeah. No, and I will say, like, I had not read this book and I had not read any of Rachel's other fiction. So this was like my first. Well, I take that back. I hadn't read, but I had watched Doom Patrol.
Yes, there.
Yeah. So and a lot of the television show is based on her run of the comic. So like, I guess that was my exposure to like her fiction writing or her storytelling. But this really is like a mythic book. Like it is really, I liked the Carcass review, although I always find their reviews kind of weird. But the first it starts out as like a lesbian love story and then goes into this whole other thing, but it doesn't really start just as that. Like Mother Night is there from chapter 1, almost page 1.
It even starts with doesn't say like this is New York. Okay, I was trying to figure out where it takes place, but
yeah, I think it's New York.
Yeah. I think it might be New York, but it takes place on a city shaped like a turtle or something like that. And it's sort of, she does little things to set it outside of time. And then there's a couple major fairy tales that show up. Probably the most prominent one is Godfather Death, which I'd heard before. It's a Grimm's Brothers fairy tale, but I didn't make the connection right away to it. Thankfully, I would have spoiled the end of the book, but in some ways. But it is sort of, where am I going with this? It is okay. Here, I have a question I have for you.
Yeah.
Sometimes people talk about fantasy and then they talk about magical realism. I'm making quoting fingers, and it sometimes seems like there's sometimes the distinction seems to be one is highbrow and one is not. But I felt like in some ways this book sort of dove into territory of like magical realism as opposed to just sort of regular fantasy. I don't know. What do you think about that distinction?
Yeah, I mean, I thought about that too, because there is such a, like, this is just the world, right, aspect to it. Like in magical realism, like the the magic, the uncanny, all that stuff happens with no explanation, is just accepted as part of the world. And I agree with you. I think sometimes fantasy and magical realism, it's like literature and genre fiction. Like it that's really the distinction, which I think is kind of arbitrary in a lot of ways. And obviously, you know, the science fiction and fantasy world thought this was an award-winning book, which I would agree with. I mean, it's unique and the storytelling is unique. But yeah, I mean, I think it does have a lot of the same kind of aspects to me that what is generally considered magical realism has, the way it's written. And I think also, to me, magical realism often has a more everyday stake, like this is human life, rather than these larger than life things that fantasy can have. And so the stakes are high for the individual people, but the stakes are not like the world, you know, all of human life in a way. Really, I mean, they are, but they're not. Yeah.
That's a useful distinction. And I hadn't thought of it that way before, but it's because sometimes I think maybe like a regular fantasy book, all of the people know they live in a fantasy world with magic, and people have to like, oh, you have to learn this spell by finding these ingredients. And like, that's not how it works in this world. And it's sort of interesting. It sort of blends goddess movement era paganism. I'm sorry, as if we're not in the goddess movement era. Sort of, okay. What I thought of
mid-90s goddess movement era.
Goddess movement.
Yeah.
Goddess, also feminist, you know, anthropology is a big part of this, and feminist academia is a huge part of this book, which Rachel was very familiar with, and like also queer liberation is a huge part of the book. And sort of those are all very real focuses with very real versions of them. And then you just meet a strange person, or you walk into a forest and there's different weird beings. And it was interesting to me how often oftentimes characters were unsettled by the magical, but there wasn't ever like disbelief of it. I think very quickly, the main character of the first part, Jake, realizes that like this woman, this like sort of amazing, like sort of like a 40s movie star type charisma, vampy kind of character shows up, and she quickly realizes that when this woman shows up, people die, and that she's sort of not what she seems. And I thought that was interesting. I thought in a urban fantasy, like she would have fought against that idea.
Yeah, like the writing reminded me a lot of Charles DeLint. Like it's very much that kind of 90s urban fantasy, I guess. You always think of Charles DeLint as kind of like everybody kind of thinks about as like the originator. I don't really think he was. I mean, obviously a lot of people were working on that, but this is clearly in that school of urban fantasy kind of writing.
Absolutely.
But yeah, it's like that. There are a lot of conversations that happen that are not like the plot conversations that I really enjoy. Like you said, like the queer liberation stuff, the lesbian movement or lesbian group on campus where the story starts. And I'm thinking like, it also feels like that first part is set like probably in the 70s or 80 or early 80s. To me, like that was kind of my guess as to when it was set.
Yeah. There's a great line in there about that. I'm sorry, you're speaking.
Oh, no. Like you're right. Like it's set kind of out of time. So it's kind of hard to place. And
there was a great line where they said, like these days, people didn't know what to think about two women in love together. They used to know what to think, which was that it was and this is me paraphrasing a little bit. Like they used to know what to think, that it was disgusting, and unacceptable. But these days, people don't know what to think, which was kind of like that. Like I guess anywhere from the 80s to the 90s of like people knowing this is around and wanting to be compassionate, but not full acceptance. There's the great there's a homecoming dance that's based around a toad, which is very strange. It was like a strange collegiate holiday about finding a toad, and which is very Rachel Pollack. And then a dance, two women dance together at a college, and there's a moment of like, oh, I don't know about that. But then also there's there's three main human characters, and then there's the great Mother Night and her I had not thought of them as Valkyries. They are biker Valkyries. You're 100%. What did you think? Maybe if we could talk about Mother Night herself. What did you think of Mother Night?
Yeah, like I it's funny because not having read this book, like I also have written death as a woman, a character
Mm.
as a character in my books. And not that I thought that it was an original thought. Death shows up as a woman a lot. But um so there was that like immediate like, oh, like that recognition of her as death as a woman. Like I think for me, death as a character as a woman has always made more sense. And I don't know if that's because of my, am identify as a woman or, live my life that way. And it always made sense to me in that kind of cycle of birth and death for death to be a woman. But the thing that I love about Rachel's version of death in this book is that death is also constrained. Death has rules. Death is
Yes.
not arbitrary.
Yeah.
And
she's like a midwife to death.
yeah, exactly. There are decisions made by characters that alter other people's lives. Like you can't just decide this person lives and that doesn't alter somebody else. And I love the scene close to the end of the book where Death takes Kate out of the hotel where they are into the parking lot, and it's filled with candles, and all of the candles represent a life. And some of them are big, tall pillar candles, and some of them are tiny birthday candles that are sputtering out, and candles that have melted into their own puddles. And, and she was like, well, if you don't want me to blow that candle out, then choose another one. And then she tells her the story of that candle. And I can blow this one out instead of the one that you don't want me to blow out. But this poet will never finish this work.
Which wasn't that poet her biological father?
I wondered about that, but I wasn't sure.
Because he was working on a poem about life or like the meaning of life when she's conceived, and he still hasn't finished it 30 years later. I don't know.
Yeah.
I thought that was interesting. But a death has rules, and it can't just make everything happy. And there's sad moments around that when Jake. I think it's bold when a writer kills one of the main characters, sort of for me, it's a very Joss Whedon kind of thing to do, but kills Jake like at the halfway mark in the book, and you're just sort of like very attached to her. And yeah.
Yeah, I did. I was reading it a lot at night before I went to sleep in the week before Christmas, which might, folks, this will come out like, for Imbolc, Candlemas. So, but I was reading it the week before Christmas, which is probably not the best week to read a really sad book.
Yeah.
but at that point, I just kind of closed the book and I was like, damn it, Rachel.
Yeah, why?
Yeah.
Godmother Night, she shows up. Whenever she shows up, it's always there's a focus on how like fabulous and weird her outfits are. She's wearing some kind of strange hat, and she had
this almost like tatterdemalion velvet dress, and
yes, and I liked that aspect of her, and it was sort of there were like I mentioned earlier, she seems like a 40s movie star. She's always like at ease with the human characters, which maybe you would be if you're deaf. And pardon me. She is just very cool in a way that is very attractive, and it made me like want the character to spend more time with her. But then there's sort of a realization that it's not safe to be around her, and that when that shows up. And also I think another part of magical realism is how much is not explained. The at some point we were pretty sure that all of these short red-haired lesbian bikers must be some sort of spiritual being or former human beings, and it's just never explained. And that's there's a bunch of things that are never explained because it leaves a weird atmosphere to not explain the rules, and it also I don't know, it lets us sort of imagine what are Mother Night's limitations.
Yeah, like how much can she control and how much can she not control. And I think the other thing about her, and I've kind of lost my train of thought a little bit, but that I'm kind of like, do I want to spoil? But I'm also like, this is a 30-year-old book.
Yeah.
So if you don't want spoilers, stop now, go read the book and then come back. But that like theme of her being a redhead with these like, biker chick They kind of remind me of the women from Greece in a way.
Oh yeah, 100%.
Like
I
they have
pictured
these
that.
pink satin motorcycle jackets,
Yeah.
and like how protected Kate is when she's with them, which is weird to think of this child being protected in a bubble of death, right? Which is and
Yes.
that. And then there's a sequence when Kate is still a child, when the dead kind of try to have the revenge and have like
Mhm.
this market where they're selling the garbage of their lives.
Yes, that was creepy as
And
heck.
they're so mad at Mother Night for having the pet living
Mhm.
person or non-dead, as they call them,
Yeah.
Kate.
And I feel like people who are mediums or have a feel like they have a medium gift or a strong medium gift. I don't know how that works. But I feel like they do feel like they don't exist. From what I hear from them is that they don't feel like they completely exist in either world with the living and the dead.
Mm-hmm.
So that sort of Kate is sort of Lori and Jake are kind of every women, if they were every lesbian characters. They're just sort of they're normal people, with normal hopes and fears and dreams and powers. Whereas Kate has this other life where her godmother shows up and takes her in a hot air balloon or takes her to watch stars die.
Mm-hmm.
There's a beautiful scene because as much as Mother Night is a goddess of death, she's also very intimately connected with life. And there's that scene where she's showing Kate how stars die, and sometimes their dust reaches other worlds and forms life.
Mm-hmm.
And sort of, I think that more cosmic view, more galactic view of life and death, as opposed to the very personal experience that the characters are having, was really interesting.
Yeah. Well, I think to me, that scene also like Mother Night becomes death, not just in this kind of earthly allegorical way, but I guess this cosmic force
Hmm.
too. You see her in this bigger, like the death, if she's in charge of the death of stars, as
Hmm.
well as the death of people and a bird and all of these things, then it's not just that. There is like, it's funny when you said that Jake and Lori are every lesbians because one of the things about this book that I thought about like in context of especially queer literature in the 90s, we were still kind of in that tragic gaze period of lit and media around queer people. Like they either for the tragic death, they never got their happy ending, and
Hmm.
this book
Hmm.
is not a happy ending for
No.
any of the characters really. I mean, you kind of don't know what's going to happen with Lori, but she's lost the love of her life and her child at the end of the book.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Sorry if you didn't have read it yet,
yeah, no,
but
I
I don't
said
think that.
spoilers,
Yeah.
spoilers,
Spoilers.
spoilers. It's a book about death.
Yeah.
People die.
It
So,
is like she does take everything from Lori, and it's sort of sorry about that. But I thought that okay, the decision to kill Kate, obviously, if it's based on since it's based on excuse me, the fairy tale Godfather death, Rachel didn't do the Disney thing and change that and make it all sweet at the end. Kate, short, beautiful life where she affected a lot of people, and Lori is left with no one other than she has friends around her, but um,
Louise,
yeah,
who's
love
probably
Louise.
my favorite side character in the book. I love
Yes,
Louise.
throughout. She's like the yeah, sidekick lesbian friend who's like, come on, come to the party. Why don't you hang out with my group of
Mm-hmm.
women who love I did love some of the political things. Like most of the time throughout the book, they're not lesbians, they're women loving women.
Mm-hmm.
Just absolutely a conversation in the 90s, right?
Mm-hmm.
What do we
Yes.
call ourselves?
Why are we called after a island none of us have lived on? Yeah,
Yeah.
that whole conversation. Yeah.
I know. Okay, the academia. I'm sorry, I'm jumping everywhere, but the academia parts of the book were interesting, and they have kind of interesting culmination in that there's this Lori, of course, is pursuing a degree in like women's studies, and she's going to this college with a women's studies program that seems itself as different, but also has its own academic feminist hangups, and she's there's great little moments in there where like they're all sort of worshiping at the altar of Marija Gimbutas and like goddess archaeology and everything wide as a womb kind of
Mm-hmm.
beliefs, but it sort of shows that Lori really has trouble with some of that and some of like the goddess the goddess I don't know not her or no goddess movement, I don't know, big goddess, big G goddess, I don't know. Things, and also there's a great everywhere. Actually, just let's talk about academia for a second. The way academia, and then how it sort of culminates with the Rumpelstiltskin bit.
Yeah.
Where she realizes it's not for her in a great moment. Like, okay, I was like Lori. Lori has to write like 3 term papers, and she has like 2 weeks to do it, and she waits till like the very end. The last date has nothing, and then Rumpelstiltskin, like Mother Night, you don't know it's her, but you kind of suspect, shows up, writes them all in one night for her, for a price yet to be determined, and Lori decides not to turn them in because this isn't for her. Were you yelling? I was yelling when that scene happened.
Yeah, I mean, again, it was like another one of those fairy tales that shows up, right? And then that also, like, because I was in a women's studies program in the 90s, like it hit a little hard.
Wow, really? Tell me more about that.
So I think there's a scene where she's talking about where she turns in this paper and her professor kind of gives her shit about her lesbian fantasy world. And that, this is a professor who is a women's studies professor who's telling her no.
Yeah.
In this way that felt unfair, like from Lori's point of view. And I think probably felt unfair from my point of view too. That it was always, it's kind of like that. Yes, these women's studies programs existed in the 90s and universities allowed them to happen, but there was still this pushback of, can you really look at these things that we don't want you to look at from a woman's point of view? And it made me think of this funny thing. And I've never said this on a podcast. I'm not going to name names, but people who know me will know who I'm talking about. But when I went to defend my undergraduate thesis, 2 of the people on my panel got in an argument about whether or not I was a feminist poet. And that was about half of my defense time, was me not talking and them arguing about what it meant to be a feminist poet.
Wow. That's incredible.
Yeah. So that whole part of her being in graduate school, like, hit really hard.
Well,
it's like, yeah.
Yeah. Also, it was interesting that, like, there's goddess religion happening in the book. And in the book's world, in the worldview of the book, that seems to be mostly about psychological and self-help and connecting self to purpose and missing, and it's not directly connected to like Mother Night, an actual goddess figure. There's a great line in there about they women's spiritual studies professor would take them to perform rituals at the lake to protect it, but it didn't seem to do much good. Humanity keeps pouring poison into it like it's cursed to do so. And it was just sort of like, that was interesting, but also there's a scene where Jake has made a terrible decision. She sort of enlisted the help of the Valkyries to cause harm, and she feels really, really messed up about it. And she meets with Lori, and she's like, I need your help. We need to do a ritual. And Lori says, do you need to do a goddess ritual? And she says, no, not that. So we need something more real. And I was like, oh, where's this going? And Jake creates a ritual that with Lori in that moment where they're working through some stuff and working through objects and I think some artwork that Jake has created. And that was a very Rachel Pollack style ritual. Like, Rachel Pollack was kind of really into getting like very intuitive and wild with it, and like would perform tarot readings by laying the cards on someone's prone body on the floor, living body on the floor to connect them to and everyone else in the space to this magic. It was very Rachel Pollack, I thought.
Yeah. No, I liked that. And the thing I think is interesting, especially kind of like in that encapsulation of like, goddess movement worship, however you want to talk about that in that particular era. And then also kind of the academia and the women's studies aspect, because one of the things that she does, which I think is brilliant, is there are men who are definitely villains in the story who get their comeuppance. The red shoes show up. The red shoes fairy tale shows up. And then there's Mark, the guy who owns the bookstore, who's like this kind of Buddhist sage guy who is the person who finds Kate's, father. And and has these words of wisdom and kind of is mystical in his own way, but in this totally other way.
Yes. Yeah. He's not I'm a practitioner of these arts and an initiate.
Mm-hmm.
He's just a wise dude who's read a lot and
Mm-hmm.
knows how to listen is one of the things that
Mm-hmm.
they figure out with him. I will say it's just wild. One of the moments where I was like, okay, this is a fantasy, but also of its of the 90s is that Lori is a manager at a bookstore and can support a wife and child on
In New
that pitch.
York.
Yeah, in New York.
Yeah.
Okay, you had me there. Goddesses of death showing up at your dance. Like I understand,
Whatever,
but
that's fine. But
the economics of it all.
yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, Morgan
And
is a different kind of character.
yeah. And I mean, I guess the other like kind of prominent male character in the book is then the artist at the end.
Yes.
So
What do you want to talk about? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, like that whole scene, like the whole arc with her going to this artist's deathbed, Kate going to this artist's deathbed. I feel like this might be circular for people who haven't read the book, but that's when Kate kind of makes the decision that that sets the rest of the book in motion, right? That's the pivotal scene. But that his artwork is, is really affecting to Kate. But as a person, he's kind of an asshole.
Yeah.
Like he's an asshole to women. He's an asshole to the guy who works for him. He's an asshole to his daughter that Kate falls in love with. He's just not a great guy. And yet she makes this decision that impacts everything about her life from that point to the end of it, which is not very long.
Yeah. She wasn't saving like a young woman who, with a future. I thought it was interesting that, so Kate's whole shtick at the end, the daughter of the two ladies who's been chaperoned at this point through her whole life by Mother Night has become sort of like a death guru, right? And travels to centers, and the center that she's speaking at the end is very much seems to be inspired by Omega Institute, where Rachel Pollack, when she was alive, taught classes on tarot and other subjects. But her whole thing is about acceptance of death and the beauty of death, even in the real confronting the real ugliness of death. And her presentations has some very shocking imagery that I don't think I would want to attend one of her programs. But so she's all about this acceptance of death, but then she's in a moment where she gets arrogant. I think that's like the hero's journey moment, is that her arrogance, she can thwart death and really impress everyone, and especially impress the lady in the room, which was fun. And and it was having it be him, having him be such like a boor, is that a word? A boorish person or whatever. It was interesting because it made it all about, it was Kate's decision to do this for herself. And then to your point, it from that point on, she's no longer comfortable with death completely. And at the end it tries to avert fate.
Because she's already messed it up. Like her decision switches fate, I guess. I don't know how, like it does make me think of, there's so many stories based on the idea that if you save one life, then another has to go in that place. Right.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what this is, like because she saved the artist's life, then another life has to be taken. And it's one that Kate really doesn't want to be taken.
Yeah. I thought that was interesting because it wasn't, I think in the original fairy tale, when the male doctor who had death as his godfather, makes that action, it's sort of seen as his arrogance. Death is punishing him, whereas in this, it's just the laws of death, and Mother Night herself is like, I told you not to do it, not because of me or my rules, but because what I want, but because of you. I was worried about like doing that harmed you, kind of thing. I thought that was a really interesting choice, and it allowed us to still love Mother Night at the end, even from a distance.
It doesn't make her the villain in the story at all.
Yeah.
The one thread through the story, and I've thought about this a lot since I finished the book. It's been one of those things that pops into my brain every time I think about it. But like before Jake gets pregnant with Kate, she has this experience, this very negative experience with Lori's dad,
Yeah.
and winds up kind of getting lost in the woods and ill, and finds this child with these shiny bones that she wants her to help her bury. And then Kate encounters that child later
Yes.
after she digs up the bones. And then the child shows up again at the end, and Lori sees her but doesn't know who she is.
Who was that kid?
Who is the kid? I mean,
Who's that kid? Yeah.
what is that? I mean, to me, I was like, Rachel doesn't expand on who that is or what that is supposed to represent. But it's clear it's important because all three of the characters also experience this. And part of me wondered, okay, so is because the child has the tragic story and is being pursued by this wraith. I don't know, something that Mother Night dispatches, but says they'll be back.
Yeah.
And the child, is blonde and fair haired and glowy. And I'm like, is the child life? Is this the counterpart to Mother Night? Like, I don't know. And Rachel doesn't tell us. And I think you kind of leave the novel going, maybe, does that mean that Lori's ending might be happy after all? Because she walks off with this child? Or
there's a great moment in that. So in that first fever dream kind of moment, which actually kind of almost is a fever dream because Jake is harmed and bleeding and she's I don't know. As I was listening to the audiobook, I listened to it again because I was like, did I miss something? Did I not understand this scene? And it is just sort of wild. It had kind of like kind of reminded me of like the night circus kind of thing, like where sometimes a scene is more about the atmosphere. But there's a great moment in there where she helps the child, and Mother Night tells her, because you did that, it will help you more than you know, or whatever, however she phrases it. Like I wondered if was the golden child can't be Kate because Kate. Well, I don't know. I guess I wondered if it was Kate because she shows up again when Lori is really struggling with the idea of having a child. She doesn't want a kid. And it was also tied to the rock. There's a magic rock that someone just finds, and it kind of has this image on it that looks like a boatman. Imagine a rock.
I think of like the ferryman. That's kind of what I imagine it. Yeah.
Yeah, the Charon. Yeah, and which Rachel Pollack could look at a rock and see that, and she's got that kind of scope. But I don't know. I wondered if it was Kate. But does Kate meet the little golden child?
Yeah, at the end.
Oh, she does. Yeah, so I can't figure out what is. So yeah, it is, and I think like honestly, I don't know. I'm not trying I don't need everything to be pat and all the rules to make sense. My better half is really into like hard magic systems in fiction and wants to know, all it all to make sense and operate the right way. And those are like beautiful, clever puzzles sometimes to me. And in this one, just sort of weird atmospheric things happen, and I was down for it.
Yeah, no, I like that space to have the reader bring like their own experience to it and like their own knowledge of these stories and who is this person and what does this mean? And I like that there's not really a bow at the end either.
Right. Yeah.
Like we don't even really know how Kate dies.
We don't know how Kate dies, and we also don't know. Like I was wondering, is Kate going to be a Valkyrie now? Is she one of the girls? But she doesn't seem to be.
Yeah. There was, speaking of Kate's death and Lori at the end, there's the throwaway line earlier in the novel about the living used to listen to the dead. And at the end, Lori tunes into this radio station and she hears Jake's voice and then she hears Kate and realizes they're talking.
Yeah.
And I was like, that was so lovely and such a great, I think this, whatever your belief system is, this idea that somehow the dead are reunited, right?
Yeah. I hope so. I'm really, really banking on there being an after death. But yeah, that she never. There's a beautiful thing through line, like one of the more human through lines through the book is through the second half of the book is Lori would always say to Kate, "Oh, well, your mother," and then Kate would say, "You're my mother," and like Lori never really felt that way.
Yeah.
And preserves the chair that she finds Jake dead in, and
Mm-hmm.
and preserves sort of a shrine in her life to Jake and isn't dating, which absolutely makes sense. But there's just this sort of beautiful. I thought it was lovely that Kate, Laurie's mom,
Mm-hmm.
like mom happy the best that she can. She doesn't have a relationship with Jake at all till the very end, and
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was one of the more human moments, especially probably for like, there's a bunch in there about lesbian rights
Mm-hmm.
and rights to children and adoption rights that I thought was kind of fascinating.
Yeah. And I mean, I think, she handles, like, there's so much going on in this novel. There's so many comments on things like the difference between Jake's parents and how they deal with her coming out and having a girlfriend, and then kind of embrace Lori and Kate after Jake dies. And then there's Lori's family, who everybody loves, who turns out they're kind of horrible people.
Yeah.
And they're missing from the rest of the book. But yeah, there's just so many layers to the book, and I think so many ways to read it. And after I finished it, I started reading 78 Degrees of Wisdom again because I had it on the shelf.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, so I want to read this with like fresh eyes from the thing.
Yes.
And you get it from chapter 1. Like, it changes the way you read the book. You were absolutely right.
It is. I guess like some people read 78 Degrees of Wisdom, and the first time I read it, I think I made the mistake of thinking that like Rachel's explaining what the cards mean, and she's more explaining how to think about expansively about the cards, meaning like,
Mm-hmm.
'cause she'll like talking about the Fool, and she'll talk about the numerology and the Hebrew letter and all the sort of the correspondences that you're used to, and then just she'll get into like the Joker from Batman or
Mm-hmm.
cool characters in different myths. And it's not that she's trying to have you memorize this or like that's the meaning if you're asking like, am I going to get this job? But it's just getting you to think expansively about that. And so if anyone hasn't read it, 70 Degrees of Wisdom is wonderful. Um, I guess like some people, I've seen some reactions. It was recently re-released in the third edition, and I found some people saying like, "Well, this is very dated," and I don't know. I think anything. I don't know. I don't go there. But her second book that I really, really think every tarot reader should check out is also just been re-released. I think it was re-released after her passing, and it is A Walk Through the Forest of Souls, which combines the original title was The Forest of Souls and some other material written after it. And it to me is her magnum opus for tarot readers because it is the book on how to do wisdom reading. Just really briefly, what wisdom reading is for Rachel Pollack was to do sort of more philosophical questions where you ask, what is the soul? And what is the tarot? And how there's a reading in the book which is the reading that God used to create the universe. And the intention is not that these are literal readings.
Mm-hmm.
And the intention also isn't that they're just a waste of time, but they're like kind of sacred readings to do. And I find them very helpful. And I find that I love doing predictive readings for someone about how to solve a problem. And that's my style. And that if the Tarot of Vampires guidebook is very much about how to use tarot in that way. But Rachel Pollack's sort of expansive view of just, asking questions like, how does this particular Bible story explain this sequence of the tarot is a way to get you and again, you're not meant to memorize it. You're meant to like take that with on the road with you, and like, how do I think about my myths, and how did they show up in the tarot, and how can I use that? Does any of that make sense?
No, it totally makes sense because I think that's one of the things, like the kind of the thread from Godmother Night into the other stuff is that Rachel calls to these archetypes, but then kind of turns them on their head a little bit or makes them her own. Like in the fiction, like, yes, there are these archetypes, and yes, she brings in these very well-known Rumpelstiltskin, Godfather Night, the red shoes, like all these things show up as part of these people's lives, but not in the way you expect. And I think for me, like in 78 Degrees of Wisdom, and I have not read A Walk
Through the Forest of
yet, but
Souls.
I'm is now on my list. is that I see that in how she talks about especially the major arcana in 78 Degrees of Wisdom, is these ideas that you don't have to know, you don't have to memorize all these things, but to know kind of what these archetypes are based on gives you space to pull in your own experience of those in your own life. And I think that's where that pop culture stuff and her experience writing for comics and like all of that kind of just threads together in this way that you're like, yeah. And to me, like the most interesting thing about tarot as a writer is every time you look at the card, you're going to see something different because your context and looking at it has changed.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And it's just so expansive in that way. And without ever like being worried about the wrong answer, which is helpful, especially if you're like me and really focused on writing wrong answers. I have two funny little stories that I think tie into this about Rachel. I was doing a PantheaCon, which is an amazing pagan conference in California. And one year Rachel there's things that would happen only to Rachel. And she was teaching a class about finding the gods in the tarot and looking at the major arcana of the tarot and connecting gods to them. And she's talking about the Empress. And she's talking about the goddess being Shekinah, who is the feminine. My version is that she, the feminine form of God in the Hebrew faith, and God's feminine self. And she's talking, and she looks down, and she stops, and she looks at this woman, and she's like, "Excuse me, my dear. Does your name tag say your name is Shekinah?" And the woman said, "Yes." And she's like, "Well, good. I'm so glad you could be here for this. Here is your card." And she talks to her, and it was a wild moment. That was a simple one. But another one where I got to see Rachel in action doing this, where this isn't just sort of like philosophical falderall to make yourself feel interesting or vaunted. She kind of would live it. And we were in a Tuesday giving a presentation on a tarot spread created based on the poem To Walk in Beauty by an indigenous author whose name escapes me at this moment. But she had this reading. She kind of presents it how to walk in beauty, and she asks the room, "Is there anyone here who has a question that we can explore with this spread?" And this woman immediately, "Yes, I do." She goes up, and you kind of think like, so Rachel's like, "So what's her question?" And it was, "Well, I recently was in a ritual and I came into contact with the diva of plastic," meaning DEVA, the nature spirit of plastic. "And they're very upset because humans think the plastic is bad and plastic is actually wonderful." And I think everyone in the room was like paralyzed, like, "What? What is your question? What's going on?" And Rachel was like, "Okay, that's the question, diva of plastic." And uses the spread to explore this idea of a godlike being of plastic, of human created, and all of it. And it was a directional poem, which is based on the indigenous ideas about the directions, and goes through all of it. And I was just like, what banana. And then at the cocktail party that night, one of the rooms, approached her and talked about her, and I was like, that was an interesting class that was an interesting reading. And Rachel just said, "Yeah, it was wild, wasn't it?" Like, it was wild for her too, that like she met a representative of the diva of plastic, but she wasn't thrown by that at all. Like, it wasn't like that's an odd question. It made sense to her that this was the question, and she was the only person I feel like on earth at that moment who could take that reading and run with it. So that was a fun moment with Rachel Pollack.
Yeah. Oh, thank you for sharing that. That's lovely. Yeah, I think for me, like one of the things thinking about Rachel in the last few days, well, honestly, since her death, is like how much she's influenced like modern occultism through tarot and all these other things, and writing, and writers in like the urban fantasy, sci-fi, however you want to look at it, I always think those labels are kind of somewhat mutable, but I was just thinking like all of the threads from Rachel's work into all of these other things. And I said at the top, we mentioned Neil Gaiman talking about, posting about her going into hospice. And that was kind of when people knew that it was close to the end. And how much he's talked about how influenced by her work he is, and how like 78 Degrees of Wisdom is one of the things he goes to when he's stuck, which I thought was interesting. And just this all these threads tied together, and then literally almost everyone who comes on the show talks about Neil Gaiman, or one of us brings up Neil Gaiman,
Yes,
which I think is funny. So
he's fabulous, and but also in the wake of her passing, so I knew the tarot part of her life, and I knew a little bit about like I knew she was a comic book writer and all the and things like that, but like people have written so many things about her. And one of them was a person who just wrote about her experience with the transgender movement within feminism and terrible time that Rachel had, where she was basically shunned in the lesbian feminist community because of her being transgender, or times that feminists would shun her for being a lesbian. And it was a beautiful op-ed, and it just was like, here's another community completely impacted, by her life. Yeah, and it makes sense that she was in the company that she kept. And Neil Gaiman is pretty high on my list of people.
Yeah.
Do you happen to have a tarot deck nearby that we could receive a message from Rachel?
I do. Let me grab one. Funnily enough, the closest one at hand is one that Benabelle One, our mutual friend, gave me.
Oh, love Benabelle. Hi, Benabelle.
She had an extra copy of the Rosebud Tarot.
Oh, yeah.
So that's the one I have closest to me. And it was funny because when I looked at this the first time, so the first deck I owned was the Voyager Tarot.
Wow.
Yeah, it's 90s, right? Which is for people who've never seen the Voyager Tarot, it's a collage deck from a lot of pictures that I swear came out of National Geographic. I think they actually got sued for copyright infringement.
Possibly. This is pre-AI.
Yeah, and it's no longer in print. Like you can find copies online for a couple $100. But the deck that I have now, because I had my own deck, and then my dad also had a deck. So the deck I use now is the deck that belonged to my dad. But this one was the one at hand. So what would you like me to do with this deck?
Well, I guess it seems like a good time to receive a message from Rachel.
Okay.
Dealer's choice, but we could ask her about, does she have any message about the book, or does she have a message about death? Okay. Or both.
So just one, you want me to just pull one?
One card. Let's see how good we are.
Okay. All right. This feels like high pressure for some reason. Oh, interesting. So I'm not sure what this is supposed to represent. I may have to get out the little white book. The generosity of water is the
generosity of water. Okay. Yeah. And that sounds like they changed the court cards a little bit.
Yeah. So let me see. I think it is the court card.
If anyone's listening, tarot guidebooks are hard to write, and you should never feel bad about reaching out to the guidebook to get your beginning or to start off. Yeah.
So the court cards in this deck, I haven't really looked at it very much yet, are curiosity, velocity, generosity, and sovereignty. So kind of the queen, I think.
Queen of Cups. Yeah. Okay. So in another deck, the Queen of Cups, in the Rosebud deck, the generosity of water. I mean, let's run with it. I'm beginning by getting into like Rider-Waite-Smith tarot heads. Like, well, the Queen of Cups is the one who, like, let's not go there. The generosity of water. I mean, the great generosity of water is that it supports all life on this earth, and from it was what we were sort of encapsulated in, the first single-celled creatures that all of us share ancestry with every bloodline on the planet. I think I just watched a documentary about this, and I'm feeling this, but like the water. So the questions about death is like, it is a return to source. It is a return to like a vast sea of the origins of life. I'll put a pin there and let you.
No, when you said that, I immediately thought of like primordial, like coming from and returning to this, I guess, that expansiveness. And then also I so associate cups with emotion and love, and that, which I thought if the word that came to mind was expansive.
Yes.
I think.
Yeah. And then the idea of I love you said a little bit of emotion, because I think when someone's very sad about a death, there is like a desire to sort of shift their perspective. So some people get it. It's like, well, they're in a better place. They're not suffering. All things die. Any of that, rigmarole. And I think that the generosity of water suggests that it's very okay to mourn as deeply as you need to, because the Queen of Cups, the goddess of water, is big enough to enfold us in that moment and to be there for our emotions. I think like the King of Cups gets into when we have to like organize our thoughts a little bit and like, maybe go see a therapist, whereas the Queen of Cups is just vast, deep well of listening. I said the word just, and I didn't mean it.
Yeah. Well, and I think I was listening to a podcast, and I have source amnesia, and I can't remember because I always listen to them right before I go to sleep. But it was talking about grief and dealing with grief. And it's been kind of a year of grief for me in a lot of ways. And that when she finally went to a therapist about grieving her father, and the person talking in the podcast, her therapist told her that she would miss the intensity of her grief later, because that intensity of grief was a proximity to the person you had lost.
Wow.
And I was like, whoa, I had never thought about it in those ways before. And that made me think of how, like, later in grief, it'll catch you off guard. And I've always said it's like getting hit by a rogue wave when it catches you, because you don't expect something to trigger it, and it's just overwhelming in the moment. Even if it's a really old grief, it can just overwhelm you in that moment. Yes. And so all of that kind of tied in, and then thinking about like the real grief in this book, and like grieving Rachel's death, and all of those things all together just kind of tied up. So
absolutely. So if any of us have any need to connect with Rachel Pollack, going to a very large body of water and finding a moment, making an offering, might be something that this card is also helping us know about that. But the proximity of grief and the missing, I want to hear that. So you will miss the intensity of this early grief because of its proximity to that person. That's astounding.
Yeah.
Well, on that wonderful note,
really.
Thank you, Rachel Pollack. Thank you wherever you are. Thank you, creator of the Rosebud Tarot, for titling this card "The Generosity of Water."
Yeah, I like that. Clearly, I need to spend more time with this deck, but it's also a collage deck, is why I think I was drawn to it. And Benamo, and I talked about that. It's like a Victorian version of the Voyager Tarot kind of way, because it's a lot of rosebuds. And the image on this card, for people who cannot see it because podcasts are an audio medium, is kind of like the Wata Wakiki. I can't think of the Florida mermaids at the bottom. It's like a woman in a mermaid costume kind of at the bottom of a tank with fake reefs and water above her with roses. So lovely card. It is a lovely deck too.
Atargatis, wasn't she a mermaid goddess and associated with sort of terrifying things as well?
Oh yeah. I mean, mermaids in general, I always feel like, we've kind of Disneyfied them, obviously, but mermaids are scary.
Yeah, you don't want to see one if you're not tied to a mast. Probably.
No, sirens were not sailors' friends. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Wow, very cool. So that's a very Rachel Pollack-y, I think, thing to do with the like ask. So what is death? And it makes it a little not scary. I've actually, because I'm someone who's very afraid of maybe a lack of a conscious afterlife. I did do a reading. I kind of think it was like Rachel Pollack would ask, like, we'll ask death what it is, and I did a 3-card reading about the transit, the moment of death, the transition, and then the outcome. And I just it was very helpful. And of course, again, it's not meant to be literal. I'm not meant to. She cautions people and walk the force of souls to not get in. If you're a tarot reader, not to get into this idea that you are superior to other people because you know things they don't. Just know the things that you know. And it was a very powerful reading. And also a very confronting reading, but I think often these sort of practices are.
Yeah, no, and I think that, for me, I go back and forth between wanting to be like a true believer and being slightly skeptical, or a lot skeptical.
Yeah.
Right. So I mean, I kind of waver between when you read with an oracle deck or a tarot deck,
Mhm.
what are you tapping into? Are you tapping into your own conscious,
Yeah.
subconscious? Or are you tapping into some larger conscious? And I think at this point in my life, I'm happy with not really knowing the answer to that question and just kind of rolling
Yeah.
with it. And I like that idea that you don't really know things that other people don't know. You're tapping into
Yeah.
stuff that we all have access to,
Yeah.
whether or not we seek it
Yeah.
is the
I like
question.
this. So she addresses this in Walk the Four Souls, and I'll let people read it. But she's not, she doesn't have a problem with skepticism about
Mm-hmm.
tarot. It as long as it's sort of interesting, and leads us to things. I thought about sometimes the mathematics of shuffling a deck of cards
Mm-hmm.
is such that mathematically, every time someone shuffles a deck, in theory, it's a completely unique ordering of the cards in the history of people shuffling because of like
Mm-hmm.
how big 78 divided times 77 times 76 down to one. But um, so the most insane thing I think I can imagine is that I'm going to shuffle three cards, shuffle the deck, and like the top three cards in order are the answers to my question. But it just works, and not just in the like. I absolutely think a very reasonable and useful way to look at cards is it's just we're acting the unusual images trigger something and help us go there. And I think that's a perfect way to read tarot cards. But when I have done, predictive tarot, it has worked. Sometimes the same card shows up again and again, which is like mathematically,
Very tricky.
challenging.
Yeah.
Yeah, very tricky. Possible, but more possible than you'd think, but still very tricky. And um, yeah, where was I going with any of this? But like the idea of of it just okay. Um, I struggled with this. I was like, well, I can't. It's not like I can tell my deck I can throw it on the ground and it's going to form an elephant, picture. So if I don't believe that, what I'm like, well, but you don't believe it could do that, but you do believe because you've been able to. You reread the deck and have the right cards come up. So maybe just like have a little faith. But I think, but you mentioned right before we did the reading, it felt like a high pressure moment. I think that's valuable for a reader to have, like you are connecting yourself to something other, even deep within inside of you or profoundly outside of us. Like there is a bit awe is useful.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it is. And I mean, I think for me, and maybe this is just Rachel pulling this out. I don't know. But for me, like the thing that I will admit to being a seeker of is that feeling of awe. Like that's to me, like when I know I'm in the presence of something bigger than me. And I've felt it in places that were unexpected. I felt it in places where people are like, oh, well, that's where you should feel that. And then, there's just moments where you're like, why now in the middle of the street, in the middle of a city you've never been to, and you see a sign, kind of like Rachel looking down at that woman's name tag and going, oh, is her name Shakina?
Yeah,
Like,
you're here. Of course you're here.
yeah,
How am I doing?
like that kind of
Um,
stuff. And to me, those uncanny things or coincidence or whatever, maybe it's just the chaos of the universe. And maybe that's how the universe talks to us. I
oh,
don't
good.
know.
I think this is a great time of the year. Imbolc is a wonderful time for awe. I like Imbolc. I'm really excited. I got to be the Imbolc session for this because I think it's gonna sound like a hipster thing. It's like it's an underrated Sabbath, but I mean, I'm excited about Halloween, there's Samhain, and Beltane. Oh, sure. But Imbolc, it's like the redheaded stepchild of the Wheel of the Year. But it is a beautiful time between like the winter solstice. Maybe we have like a kernel of an idea of what we want to plant for the new year, who we want to become as we get to stroll around when the Wheel of the Year one more time. But Imbolc is a time for expansive thinking and inspiration, but not really of doing anything. It's too damn
Mhm.
cold out. It's
Yeah.
not a time for us to really be like setting even a strategy in place, but just to be like seeking um, divine inspiration and when writing a project and feeling really bad about procrastination, it will just come in for landing to say like I learned about what useful procrastination looks like, which is useful procrastination is not avoiding it, but it's opening your mind up to possibility and
Mhm.
thinking expansively about the project and all that could be in just long enough to really be able to work on it and not be useless procrastination, which isn't helpful. And so this time of the year for me is that moment to open up to divine possibility.
I love that. And what a perfect way to tie our own bow at the end of this.
Yes, absolutely.
Perfect.
Thank you so much for having me on and reading this book with me. It was a really beautiful treasure for Rachel Pollack.
No, it was perfect. And thanks for being game. WitchLit is a production of 1000 Volt Press and is edited by Julian Rashke. Our intro music is Cosmic Glow by Andrew Kay, and our outro music is Voices by Alexander Shenekar. Transcripts and all our previous episodes are available at witchlitpod.com, and you can follow us on Instagram and Threads at witchlitpod. Please help other witches find us by leaving a rating or review wherever you listen to podcasts. Thank you for listening to and reading WitchLit.